"Nobody's coming for you," the station master said.
I'm not
Not
moving another
unkindly,
step.
just tired. The way a man gets tired of saying true things nobody wants to hear. Mercy Calloway stood on the platform at Willow Bend with a carpet bag in one hand and a photograph in the other. And she did not cry, because she had promised herself on the train that she was done with crying. 6 women had stepped off that train in Willow Bend over the past 2 months. Each one claimed within the hour by a rancher or a shopkeeper or a widower with children who needed minding. Mercy was the 7th. She had been standing on this platform for 3 hours. The photograph in her hand showed a man named Thaddeus Pruitt, 40 years old, owner of a modest spread outside of town, a face like a closed door. His letters had been polite and brief. His absence today was neither. He sent word, the station master admitted, shuffling a telegram across the counter like he was ashamed of it. Changed his mind. Says the arrangement's off. Around her, the town went about its business. A wagon creaking past loaded with feed sacks, a dog barking at nothing, the blacksmith's hammer ringing 2 streets over in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Nobody looked at her twice. A woman alone on a platform with a cancelled engagement was not a curiosity in a town like this. It was simply Tuesday. Mercy set her bag down and sat on it, because there was nowhere else to sit, and because her legs had decided, without consulting her, that they were finished holding her up. She was 26 years old. She had crossed 4 states to marry a stranger because the alternative, staying in Ohio, in her brother's house, eating his wife's resentment along with her cooking, had seemed at the time like the harder road. Now she wasn't sure there was any road at all. That was when she heard the horse. It came at a canter, not a gallop, but fast enough that heads turned, fast enough that the blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. The rider was a big man on a bay gelding, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and he pulled up so hard in front of the platform that the horse threw its head and stamped. Annoyed. "You the one Pruitt jilted?" he asked. No greeting, no apology for the bluntness. Mercy looked up at him, and something in her, pride, maybe, or the last scrap of dignity she had left, straightened her spine before she decided to let it. "I don't believe that's any business of yours." Fair enough. He didn't dismount. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measures a person rather than admires them. And then he looked away, out toward the ridge where the land went gold and empty toward the mountains. "I heard in town there was a bride nobody wanted. Figured I'd come see for myself before somebody said something ugly to you that I'd have to answer for. That's a strange kind of chivalry. I don't have the other kind." His name, she would learn, was Cole Ransom, and he ran 300 head of cattle on land his father had bled for and his grandfather had stolen from people who'd had no paper to prove they'd owned it first. A fact Cole did not hide, because hiding things, she would come to understand, was not in his nature. He had not sent for a bride. He had not asked for one. He had simply ridden into town on ordinary business and found himself unable to ride back out again with a woman sitting on a train platform like abandoned luggage. "I'm not looking for charity," Mercy said. "Good. I'm not offering any." Cole finally swung down from the horse, and up close he was older than she'd first thought, with a scar through one eyebrow and hands scarred rougher still, the hands of a man who did his own branding and his own doctoring and had, by the look of the newest mark on his knuckles, done his own fighting recently too. "I've got a spare room, a housekeeper who talks too much, and a ranch that could use another set of capable hands if you've got them. That's the whole offer. No promises past that. And if I say no, then I ride back out and you figure your own way, and neither one of us thinks less of the other for it." He said it plainly, like a man reading off a list of supplies. "But the afternoon train east doesn't come through till Thursday, and I wouldn't leave a dog out here that long, let alone a person." Mercy looked at the photograph still in her hand, Thaddeus Pruitt's closed-door face, and then let it fall into the dust at her feet, where the wind could have it. She looked at Cole Ransom instead, at his scarred eyebrow and his unpromising honesty, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon, the smallest flicker of a decision that was entirely her own. "I've got capable hands," she said. "Then get on the horse," Cole said, already turning. "We'll talk terms on the way." Behind them, the station master watched them go and shook his head slowly, already composing the story he'd tell at the saloon that night, though even he didn't yet know how strange and how hard that story was going to get before it was through. The ranch house was smaller than Mercy expected and better kept than she'd hoped. Whitewashed, with a porch that sagged only slightly and a garden gone to weeds that spoke of good intentions and no time. The housekeeper, a broad, blunt woman named Ottilie, took one look at Mercy's traveling dress and pronounced, "Well, you won't last the week in that," which turned out to be the kindest thing anyone said to her for 3 days. The terms Cole offered, once they'd sat at his kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, were plain as everything else about him. She would have the spare room. She would help Ottilie with the house and, if she was willing, with the ledgers, since he could rope a steer blind but numbers gave him a headache he'd rather not have. In exchange for room, board, and wages, she was under no obligation of marriage, courtship, or anything resembling either. "You didn't bring me here to be your wife," Mercy said slowly, working it through. "I brought you here because leaving you on that platform felt like a sin I didn't want on my ledger." Cole's jaw was tight, the way a man's gets when he's saying something true that costs him to say. "What happens after is yours to decide, not mine to arrange." It should have been a relief. Instead it unsettled her, this offer of a kindness with no strings sewn into it, because in her experience kindness always came with strings, and a man who claimed otherwise was usually the one holding the sharpest one, hidden. She watched him for signs of it over the following days and found none, which unsettled her further. The town, however, was less generous than Cole. Word traveled fast in Willow Bend, the way it does anywhere small enough that everyone's business is everyone's entertainment. Mercy felt the weight of it on her first trip into town for supplies, women drawing their children a little closer, a shopkeeper's wife who wouldn't quite meet her eye, a low ripple of talk that stopped whenever she came within earshot and started again the moment she'd passed. "They think you're his fancy woman," Ottilie said flatly, loading flour sacks into the wagon without looking up. "Or worse, they think you tricked Pruitt out of marrying you so you could land Cole instead, seeing as he's the better catch of the two. That's absurd. I've been here 4 days. Absurds never stopped a rumor from having legs." Ottilie finally looked at her, not unkindly. "Cole's got his own trouble in this town, girl. You'd do well to learn it before you decide whether staying's worth the talk." Cole's trouble, Mercy learned that same week, had a name. Silas Pruitt, Thaddeus's older brother, a man who ran the largest spread in the county and had wanted Cole's land, good water, better grass, for going on 10 years. Cole had refused to sell 3 times. The bad blood between the families ran deep enough that when word reached Silas that his brother's jilted bride had landed on Cole Ransom's doorstep instead, he took it as a personal insult, as though Cole had reached out and plucked the humiliation from Thaddeus's hands just to rub the family's nose in it. It was Silas himself who rode out to the ranch on the 6th day, 3 men behind him, all of them wearing the particular calm of men who expect no resistance. "Heard you took in my brother's leavings," Silas said from horseback, not bothering to dismount, looking at Mercy the way a man looks at property he's deciding whether to bid on. "Didn't take you for charitable, Ransom. Or maybe it ain't charity at all." Mercy felt her face go hot, and beside her she felt Cole go very still. Not the stillness of a man backing down, but the stillness of a man deciding exactly how much restraint the moment required and measuring it out like medicine. "She's under my roof of her own choosing," Cole said, "and she'll leave it the same way, when and if she pleases. That's the whole of it, Silas. Nothing here concerns you. Everything on this side of the river concerns me one way or another." Silas's eyes moved to Mercy again, lingering. "You're a long way from anyone who'd vouch for your character, ma'am. Man like Cole could tell this town anything about you and who'd say different?" It was meant to frighten her. Mercy understood that. It was meant to remind her how alone she was, how easily a woman with no family within 4 states could be talked about, talked over, talked into leaving. She felt the old fear rising, the fear that had sat with her on every mile of that train, and she made, in that moment, the first wholly active choice she'd made since stepping off the platform. "My character isn't for sale, Mr. Pruitt, and neither is my silence," she said, stepping forward instead of back, though her hands trembled at her sides where he couldn't see them. "I'll thank you to speak to me directly if you've something to say about me, rather than over my head like I'm livestock at auction." Something shifted in Silas's face, surprise, and beneath it, an uglier thing, the particular anger of a man and used to being answered. He said nothing more. He turned his horse and rode off with his 3 men trailing, but not before his gaze swept the property once, slow and assessing, in a way that made Ottilie mutter something under her breath about locking the henhouse tonight. Cole watched them go until they were dust on the ridge. "That wasn't nothing," he said quietly. "That was a man drawing a line and daring us to cross it." "What line?" "The one that says this is his land, one way or another, and he'll take it fair if he can and foul if he must." Cole finally looked at her, and there was something new in his face. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. "You should know that before you decide to stay. It won't be the last visit. I didn't come this far to run from the first ugly man who rode up my road," Mercy said, and meant it more than she expected to. The fire came 11 nights later, and it came the way trouble always seems to, not when they were braced for it, but when the ordinary business of living had finally lulled them into believing the danger had passed. Mercy woke to Ottilie's voice, sharp and close, and to a light through her window that had no business being there at 2 in the morning. She was out of bed and into her boots before she'd fully understood what she was seeing. The north hay barn burning, flames already climbing the old dry timber with a hunger that made the whole night sky flicker orange. Cole was already outside, already shouting orders. Bucket lines, the horses out of the near paddock before the wind could carry sparks that far, Ottilie to the well pump, Mercy to help her. There was no time for fear in the doing of it, only the doing itself. The burn of the bucket handle against her palms, the heat pressing at her face like a hand, the smell of smoke thick enough to taste, to choke on, to carry in her hair for days after. Somewhere in the chaos she heard Cole's voice go hoarse from shouting and kept moving anyway, because stopping felt like a kind of surrender neither of them could afford. They saved the house. They saved the horses. They lost the barn down to its black skeleton by the time the sky grayed toward dawn, and standing in the wreck of it, soot-streaked and trembling with exhaustion, Cole crouched beside what was left of the doorframe and found, wedged into a crack in the charred wood where it couldn't have burned or fallen by accident, a playing card. The ace of spades, nailed in deliberately, before the fire had ever been set. Silas's calling card. Cole said, "Low," and something in his voice had gone past anger into something colder. "Man wants me to know exactly who did this and dares me to prove it." "Then we prove it," Mercy said. "It's not that simple." He straightened, looking at her with the particular exhaustion of a man who's fought this fight, or ones like it, before and lost more than he'd won. "Sheriff in this county eats supper at Silas's table twice a month. There's no proving anything that man doesn't want proved. What happened 3 days later proved, at least, that the barn had only been the opening move." Mercy had ridden out alone to check the eastern fence line, against Cole's better judgment and her own stated stubbornness, because the ranch needed the work done and she told herself she wasn't going to be made a prisoner in her own home by another man's temper. She was mending a break in the wire when she heard riders, and by the time she turned, 2 of Silas's men were already between her and the way back to the house. "Mr. Pruitt wants a word," the nearer one said, in a tone that made clear the word wasn't an invitation. What followed was fast and ugly and over almost before it began. A hand closing hard around her wrist, her horse spooking and bolting free before she could mount it. The ground hard and unforgiving under her when she was shoved from it, the taste of copper where she'd bitten her own lip. She did not scream. She had promised herself, somewhere on that long train ride, that she would not be a woman who screamed and waited to be rescued, and so instead she fought, clawed, twisted, drove her boot heel into an instep hard enough to hear the man swear. Bought herself 3 seconds, for enough time to be running when Cole's voice cracked across the field like a rifle shot. He hadn't come alone. He'd come with his rifle already raised and his face set in a way Mercy had not yet seen on him, and the 2 men who'd meant to drag her to Silas Pruitt found themselves instead staring down the barrel of a gun held by a man who did not, in that moment, look inclined toward Mercy. "Touch her again," Cole said, voice low and terribly steady, "and I won't wait for a courtroom to settle it." The men rode off without her, empty-handed, cursing, and Cole was off his horse and at her side before the dust had settled, his hands hovering over her without quite touching, as though he were afraid of hurting something already hurt. "You're bleeding," he said, and his voice had cracked clean through the steadiness. "I'm alive," Mercy said, and found, to her own surprise, that her hands had stopped shaking the moment his had come near. which is more than they can say for their pride. But the danger, they both understood, standing in that torn-up field with the wire still humming from the fight, was no longer a threat hanging over the horizon. It had arrived, and it had put its hands on her, and there would be no pretending after this that Silas Pruitt intended anything less than total ruin, of the ranch, of the water rights, of anyone who stood between him and both. "This ends one way or another," Cole said, looking not at the retreating dust but at her split lip, at the bruise already darkening on her wrist, with an expression that frightened her more than Silas ever had. Not because it threatened her, but because of what it promised to do to himself. "And I mean to see it end mine." She found him on the porch that night, long after Ottilie had gone to bed and the ranch had settled into the particular silence that follows violence. Not peace, exactly, but the exhausted quiet of a body that has spent everything it had to give. Cole sat with his rifle across his knees, not because he expected trouble tonight specifically, but because he had stopped, somewhere in the last 3 hours, believing he could afford to be unready. "You should be resting that wrist," he said, without turning. "You should be resting, all of you." Mercy sat beside him anyway, on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched and not close enough that either of them had to acknowledge it. "I'm not made of glass, Cole. I've mended fences with a split lip before. This is only the first time it was a man's doing instead of the wires." He was quiet a long moment, turning something over in his hands that she hadn't noticed until he held it up to the moonlight. A small carved wooden bird, rough-hewn, the kind of thing a child might make, or a man teaching himself patience. "My mother carved this," he said. "Last thing she made before she died. I keep it because," he stopped, jaw working the way it did when a thing cost him to say, "because Silas's father is the reason she died poor and worked half to death on land that should have supported her better than it did. Water rights again. Older feud than the one you walked into. I didn't tell you that part. Would it have changed anything, the telling? Maybe you'd have taken the Thursday train after all." Mercy considered that honestly, the way she'd promised herself she would consider things now, rather than simply reacting to them. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think I'd have stayed regardless, and been glad of the true accounting instead of a partial one." She looked at the bird in his hands, at the rough, careful lines of it. "Scars mean it lived," she said quietly. "I read that somewhere once, or heard it, I don't remember which. I've thought of it more since I came here than I ever did in Ohio." Cole turned to look at her then, really look, in a way he hadn't quite allowed himself since the platform. "You've got scars of your own you haven't shown me. An arrangement broken twice before I ever got on that train," Mercy admitted, and it cost her something to say it plainly, the way honesty always seemed to cost something in this hard, bright country. "The first man died of fever before the wedding. The second decided, 3 letters in, that a wife who could read and argue was more trouble than one who couldn't. I told myself Thaddeus Pruitt would be the last humiliation I'd allow myself to risk. And then he wasn't even humiliation, he was just absence. A telegram instead of a man. I'm not going to pretend I'm better than either of them," Cole said. "I've got a temper and a feud and a barn burned to its bones. And I can't promise you Silas won't try worse before this is finished." "You rode back for me," Mercy said. "Twice now. That's not nothing, whatever else you can't promise." He set the wooden bird down on the step between them. Not quite an offering, not quite nothing either, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, letting the night settle around the things they'd said, which felt, in that particular silence, like more than either of them had said aloud to another person in a long time. "There's a term I never wrote into our arrangement," Cole said finally. "Low. Wasn't sure I had the right to ask it, given how you came to be here. But I'd ask it now if you'd let me. Ask it, then. Stay because you want to. Not because a stranger paid your train fare. Not because Thursday's train is the only alternative. If Silas burns every board on this property to the ground, I'd rather you standing beside me be a choice you made than a debt you're paying." Mercy looked out at the dark line of the ridge, where 3 days ago riders had come to drag her off her own land, and thought of the platform at Willow Bend, and the photograph she'd let fall into the dust, and the 6 months of silence from her brother's house that had felt, at the time, like the only proof she'd ever have that nobody chose her without a reason attached. "I'm staying," she said, "because I choose to. Not because of debt. Because for the first time since I stepped off that train, Somebody asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I'd have to accept. Cole reached over, slow enough that she could have pulled away, and closed his rough hand over hers where it rested on the step. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, but the warmth of it, small and real against the cold night air, sat strangely alongside the knowledge that somewhere across the river, Silas Pruitt was almost certainly already planning what came next, and that whatever piece this porch held tonight was borrowed, not bought, and would have to be paid for in the days still coming. Silas Pruitt came for the water the following week, and he came openly, which told Cole everything he needed to know about how confident the man had grown. Confident enough to stop hiding behind burned barns and hired hands, confident enough to ride onto ransom land at the head of 8 men and simply announce that the creek crossing the property line was, as of that morning, being dammed upstream on his own land, cutting Cole's herd off from water 2 full weeks before the summer heat would make that a death sentence for 300 head of cattle. There's no law against a man managing his own water, Silas said from horseback, unbothered, almost cheerful in his certainty. Sheriffs already looked at the deed. Everything upstream is mine to do with as I please. And everything downstream is mine to defend, Cole said. It was Mercy, standing beside Ottilie on the porch with the ledgers she'd spent 2 weeks putting in order clutched against her chest, who saw the flaw first. Not in the law, which was tangled and old and favored whoever could afford the better lawyer, but in the paper trail itself. She had spent those 2 weeks going through Cole's grandfather's records at his own request, untangling decades of muddled bookkeeping, and in doing so had found what neither Cole nor Silas had thought to look for. An original water-sharing agreement, drawn up between the 2 families 40 years earlier, before the feud had calcified into hatred, granting equal rights to the creek regardless of which side of the property line it crossed. It had never been formally revoked. It had simply been forgotten, the way old kindnesses get forgotten once new grievances arrive to crowd them out. You'd need a judge to see that upheld, Cole said, when she showed him, her hands still trembling slightly with the enormity of what she'd found. Then we'll find one who isn't eating supper at Silas's table twice a month, Mercy said, and there was steel in it now, the particular steel of a woman who had stopped waiting to be rescued and started doing the rescuing herself. It took 4 days to ride to the county seat and back, 4 days of Cole gone and Mercy managing the ranch in his absence with a competence that surprised even Ottilie, who had, by then, mostly stopped expecting to be surprised by her. It took one furious confrontation in a courtroom too small and too hot for the crowd that came to watch it. Silas's lawyer arguing 40 years' irrelevance against a document that was, however old, still legally binding, still signed, still true. And it took, in the end, a judge who owed Silas Pruitt nothing and was, by all accounts, rather pleased to rule against a man so plainly used to getting his way. The water rights were restored. The dam came down within the week, under threat of contempt charges Silas had no appetite to test. And Silas Pruitt, humiliated in a courtroom in front of half the county, his feud exposed as petty greed dressed up in old grievance, did not come again to ransom land, not with fire, not with men, not with anything but a cold, distant silence that Cole assured her was, in its own way, the closest thing to peace the man was capable of granting. The barn was rebuilt by autumn, with the whole community turning out for the raising. The same town that had once whispered about a woman nobody wanted now setting tables of food along the fence line. The same shopkeeper's wife who'd once refused to meet Mercy's eye now asking, with genuine curiosity, how she'd managed to find that old water agreement buried 40 years deep in a stranger's ledgers. I read things carefully, Mercy told her, simply. It's a habit that's served me better than I expected. Cole asked her to marry him on the same porch step where he'd once asked her only to stay. The wooden bird his mother had carved sitting between them again, worn now from handling. He did not make it a grand gesture. He asked it the way he asked everything. Plainly, without embellishment, offering nothing he couldn't promise to deliver. I've got a rebuilt barn, a temper I'm working on, and land that'll always have Pruitt somewhere on the horizon of it, he said. That's the whole offer. No promises past that, except the ones I mean to keep. That's not much of a proposal, Mercy said, smiling despite herself. No, Cole agreed. But it's an honest one. Same as the first offer I made you. Then I accept the same way I accepted the first one, she said, and laced her fingers through his scarred hand to healing hand, on a porch that no longer felt borrowed. Because I choose to. They were married in the spring, in the shadow of the rebuilt barn, with Ottilie crying openly despite her insistence beforehand that she wouldn't, and the whole town turning out in a way that would have seemed impossible to the woman who'd once sat alone on a train platform believing herself entirely unwanted. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had met, Mercy would tell them the true version. Not the softened one the town preferred, about a cowboy's kindness toward a stranded bride, but the fuller one. About a woman who chose to stay for herself before she ever chose to stay for him, and a man who understood, better than most, that the difference mattered more than anything else he could have offered her. The old wooden bird still sits on the mantel of the Ransom Ranch house to this day, and travelers passing through Willow Bend who ask after its story are told, simply, that it belonged to a woman who was told nobody was coming for her, and turned out, in the end, to need no one to come for her at all, except the one man honest enough to let her choose.